Welcome to the History Guy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories of lesser-known historical events told by Lance Geiger, also known as the History Guy on YouTube. I'm Josh, your host, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. We tell all kinds of stories about history, from the modern era to the ancient past, so you never know what we're going to talk about next. One thing you can be sure of, it is history that deserves to be remembered. We at The History Guy are also excited to announce a new way to interact with the team and The History Guy himself at Locals.com. Join the History Guy Guild for your one-stop location to chat with other history fans, get updates on the team, and more. You can join for free or pay as little as $5 a month to get access to live chats with The History Guy, looks behind the scenes, early access to ad-free videos, and more. Find us at thehistoryguyguild.locals.com. We look forward to seeing you there. On today's episode, the History Guy tells two stories about the age of American airships. First, he tells the story of the first American-built rigid airship, the Shenandoah, from its inception to its tragic end. Then he tells the story of the experimental airship Macon, which hoped to usher in an era of air-based carriers. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
Today is September 4th, 2018, and it is an auspicious day because 95 years ago on this date, the United States made a great leap forward in aviation history with the maiden voyage of the ZR-1, America's first American-built rigid airship. The ZR-1 was a marvel of modern technology and absolutely unique among airships in the world at the time, and it represents that brief and spectacular era when behemoths of the sky floated majestically around the world. It is history that deserves to be remembered. On a chilly night, October 19th, 1917, 11 German Zeppelins took off from their bases, planning what was one of the largest bombing raids of the era. The raid was expected to be 25 hours long, demonstrating the significant endurance advantage that airships had over aircraft at the time. The Zeppelins were meant to attack London, part of a mission to attack the British homeland, in the hopes of forcing British aircraft to be redeployed away from attacking German bases, and to terrify the British population. The German Zeppelin raids over London were particularly terrifying, as the nearly silent airships were nearly invisible at night, and night flying was particularly dangerous for aircraft at the time. Although they were attacked by British anti-aircraft guns, they managed to drop all their bombs. 36 people were killed in the raid, and 55 were injured. A single 300-pound bomb from Zeppelin L-45 fell at Glenview Road, Hither Green, London, destroying 3 houses and damaging many others. 5 women and 9 children were killed, including 7 siblings of the Kingston family between the ages of 3 and 18. It was the last bomb dropped on London by a Zeppelin. But that night, the Allies would get their revenge. While returning to the base, the airships ran into strong headwinds and heavy fog, and in the confusion, 8 of the 11 wandered over Allied territory in France. 2 were destroyed by Allied anti-aircraft, and 2 were attacked by French aircraft. Both were forced down. One of those, the Zeppelin L-49, was forced to land, realizing as the tracer bullets from the French Spads flew by that they could not escape, and that a hit from one of those rounds would cause their hydrogen-filled airship to explode. The crew hung out a white flag, and the French pilots directed them to land near Bourbon-le-Bain in northeastern France. Before the French pilots could land, the German commander destroyed the craft's wireless. He tried to set the airship on fire, but was stopped by a local man. 21 German crew were taken prisoner. But more than that, the L-49 was landed undamaged. It was the first German airship to be captured intact. The L-49 was studied and reverse engineered. The U.S. intended to use the design of the L-49 as the basis for the first American-built rigid airship, but to show the danger of traveling in those airships at the time, the U.S. design was influenced by the crashes of 2 other airships. The British had used the information garnered from the study of the L-49 to help design their own class of airship, the R-38. Initially, 4 airships of the class were to be built, but 3 of the orders were cancelled as the armistice ended the war. The R-38 was also cancelled while under construction due to budget constraints, but the United States expressed interest and the airship was purchased and completed. At the time, it was the largest airship in the world. The plan was to do some 50 hours of flight testing to test the airship and train its U.S. crew. On August 27, 1921, while being tested in northeast England, the structure of the airship collapsed amidships. Witnesses said both ends drooped, followed by a fire, and then an explosion. 28 Britons and 16 Americans died in the crash. The L-49 was of a special design, the U-class, called a height climber. The design had been made to maximize the ability to climb, making the Zeppelin safer from anti-aircraft fire. But that required reducing the weight by weakening the structure. The inquest over the crash of the R-38 found that the structure was not able to manage the stresses of maneuvering and had not incorporated new features of airship design that allowed a stronger structure. The U.S. took these lessons to heart. Unlike the L-49 and the R-38, the Roma was a semi-rigid airship. Rather than having a full internal structure, such airships are built around a rigid keel. The Roma was designed and built in Italy and purchased by the United States in 1921. It was, at the time, the largest semi-rigid airship in the world. But disaster struck in February of 1922. The airship's box steering system failed during a test flight, and the ship swung around where it hit high-voltage wires. Filled with flammable hydrogen gas, the Roma burst into flames. 34 of the airship's crew were killed. And so when the first American-built rigid airship was laid down on June 24, 1922, based very much on the German L-49, it incorporated a number of structural improvements which was supposed to help it avoid the fate of the British R-38. And to avoid the fate of the Roma, the Americans decided that they would use the rare, expensive, but non-flammable gas helium as the lifting gas rather than hydrogen. The construction of the airship, originally called the ZR-1, was quite a feat of engineering. It was to be 680 feet long, more than 100 feet longer than the battleship USS Texas. It was to be assembled in the newly constructed Hangar 1 at Naval Air Station Lakehurst in New Jersey. Hangar 1, at 966 feet long, was at the time the world's record holder as the single largest room in the world. The structure was made out of duralumin, a type of age-hardened aluminum alloy, and manufactured at the U.S. Naval Aircraft Factory at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The parts were then transported by truck and rail to Lakehurst for assembly. The first ring for the structure arrived April 22, 1922, and was more than 78 feet across. Rings were connected together with longitudinal girders. Tension wires added strength and stability. Inside, there was room for 20 gas cells, which would hold the liquid gas. The gas cells were made of rubberized cotton lined with gold beater skin, which was taken from the outer membranes of the intestines of cattle, and was one of the most gas-impervious materials known at the time. While helium has the advantage of not being explosive, the use of helium offered some unique challenges. For example, as an airship expends fuel for its engines, it becomes lighter, causing the airship to rise. To maintain neutral buoyancy, a hydrogen airship would simply release some hydrogen gas, as hydrogen is cheap and easy to produce. But helium was expensive and rare, too expensive to merely vent into the atmosphere. In fact, filling up the airship consumed a significant portion of the entire world's helium reserves. The ZR-1 instead had a system that condensed and collected water vapor from the engines, which counterbalanced the weight lost as the ship burned fuel. The frame was then covered with high-grade cotton fabric, laced tightly into place over the entire hull and given several coats of dope, which shrunk the material tight against the framework. The final coat was mixed with aluminum powder to provide a smooth, weather-resistant skin, which also reflected the sun's heat away from the lifting gas. The airship was launched on August 20th, 1923, which means that still inside the hangar it was removed from its shorings and floating free. On September 4th, 95 years ago today, some 15,000 people watched as 420 sailors and Marines walked the ZR-1 out of Hangar 1 for the first time, and using 4 of her 6 300-horsepower, 8-cylinder Packard gasoline engines, lifted off the field with 29 people on board. It was the world's first ever flight of a helium-inflated, rigid airship. The ZR-1 remained aloft for 55 minutes. The ZR-1 underwent a number of trials over the next month, flying as far as St. Louis for the 1923 St. Louis Air Races. The flight went without a hitch, but the airship was yet to be tested for its value to the fleet. The ship was christened in a ceremony on October 10th. The Secretary of the Navy, Edwin Demby's wife, Marion, did the honors, christening the ship the USS Shenandoah, named after the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. The word Shenandoah was derived from a Native American word for the river, which some translate as Beautiful Daughter of the Stars. The ship was commissioned the same day, under the command of Navy Commander Frank McCrary. The Shenandoah met its first great challenge in January of 1924. The ship had been working on mooring with the giant Lakehurst mooring mast. The mooring mast was a technological marvel in itself at over 160 feet tall, with an elevator, communication systems, electric lighting, and piping for gasoline, oil, helium, and water ballast. Once moored, the crew could exit the airship via a gangway from the nose. A mooring tower offered certain advantages over a hangar and avoided the difficult process of docking. Moreover, on long trips, hangars would not always be available. The Navy had talked about using the Shenandoah for Arctic research. On such a trip, docking facilities would be unavailable and mooring towers would have to be used for resupply. But mooring was a difficult process and took quite a lot of practice and testing. On January 14th, the Weather Service issued a warning about gale force winds. Rather than dock the Shenandoah ahead of the storm, the Navy decided to leave it moored to the mooring station to test the mooring. That turned out to be a mistake. A gust of nearly 80 miles per hour struck, collapsing the top fin and rolling the ship over. That twisted the nose cone attached to the mooring tower off, and the crippled Shenandoah was off for an exciting ride. The forward gas cells deflated and the airship pitched forward. A crash might have destroyed the Shenandoah, but the crew jettisoned ballast and ordered the crew members aft to right the ship. The ship careened across the field, nose still down, narrowly missing the treetops. The engines were started and the crew slowly regained control, shifting ballast and fuel until the Shenandoah was righted. The damaged ship rode ahead of the storm, finishing 50 miles away in Newark. Following the storm, the ship had to be nursed back, difficult to control without a nose and with its twisted top fin. But the Shenandoah had survived the worst January storm in the area in decades. President Coolidge sent a telegram of congratulations. After repairs, the Shenandoah began testing for practical application with the Navy, demonstrating that an airship could be valuable in the scouting role. A Navy oiler, the USS Patoka, was fitted with a mooring mast and specially modified as an airship tender. In October, the Shenandoah flew across the nation, from Lakehurst to San Diego, up to Washington and back, testing newly built mooring towers. It was the first rigid airship to cross North America. In 1924, the ship was laid up for repairs and modifications. Helium was so scarce that some of Shenandoah's helium was needed to inflate the new airship, USS Los Angeles. During the process, the ship's captain, Zachary Lansdowne, had 10 of the ship's automatic gas valves removed. The decision saved several hundred pounds in weight, and it limited the release of expensive helium gas, but it came at a price. As an airship rises, the gas inside the gas bags expands, and the pressure valves are there to release gas so that the gas bags don't expand to the point where they damage the airship's structure. By removing 10 of the Shenandoah's 18 automatic gas valve releases, Captain Lansdowne had limited the ability of the Shenandoah to gain altitude quickly, because if it rose too quickly, the gas valves that were less could not keep up with the expansion of the gas. In September, the ship left for a promotional tour of the Midwest, with a plan to visit state fairs and fly over Midwest cities. The trip was a risk. The thunderstorm season could be brutal in the Midwest. Commander Lansdowne argued that the trip should be canceled or at least postponed past mid-September when the season usually subsided. But his superiors would only allow the trip to be postponed until September 3rd, when the Shenandoah was expected to make a visit to the Ohio State Fair. On September 3rd, the airship was over Ohio when it hit a storm cell. Spectators described the ship as being tossed around like a bobber, at one point nearly standing on end. Convective updrafts lifted it as fast as 1,000 feet per minute, more than the remaining valve releases could handle. The Shenandoah broke in two, the aft section plummeting, killing the engineers in the section. The control car broke loose and dropped to the ground, killing the men inside, including Commander Lansdowne. 7 men in the bow managed to get enough control to release gases and free balloon to a soft landing. In all, 14 members of the Shenandoah's crew died in the accident. After the accident, many people blamed the Army and the Navy for ignoring Commander Lansdowne's warnings about the weather. Airships were really only built to be flown in good weather, and they are at particular risk over land where there can be violent updrafts. Aviator Billy Mitchell's criticism was so strong, essentially arguing that public relations had overcome safety, that he was court-martialed for his criticism and his career was ruined. But other people blamed Commander Lansdowne for the removal of the gas pressure valves. In a sorry display, spectators at the scene took away souvenirs, heedless of the aviators' deaths. The farmer upon whose land the ship had crashed charged visitors by the carload to visit the site. Today, various memorials mark the locations of the wreckage and memorialize the crash. As a result of the inquiry, the military decided to strengthen the internal structure of its remaining airships and decided to start paying more official attention to weather forecasting. But in the end, the airships just turned out to be unsafe. Of America's 4 rigid airships, only one, the USS Los Angeles, made it all the way to retirement. In 1933, the USS Akron was destroyed in a storm at sea and 73 people died. 2 years after that, its sister ship, the USS Macon, was destroyed in another storm at sea and 2 people died. And 2 years after that, the Hindenburg exploded as it was trying to land at Naval Air Station Lakehurst. The accidents put an end to the era of the common use of rigid airships.
Now's the part of the episode where we get to chat with the history guy. A little bit about what we just heard, what we're going to hear, and of course, some behind-the-scenes stuff you only get to hear about on the podcast. We'd also like to welcome back Betty Jo, my grandmother and mother of the history guy. One of the things that I think makes this pair of episodes so cool is that rigid airships are really cool. These are things that I think, are cool even if we don't use them and they're apparently very impractical. But you still see dirigibles of all kinds, and especially these big Zeppelins, in all kinds of media. And I think this episode explains why those futures never really came to be.
They were very spectacular, and they were amazing for their time. And so, there's tons and tons of film of them. There's film of them flying over cities and all sorts of things. And so that's one of the fun things when you're making the videos, is that we do have a good a degree of media that we might not have for some other things, and that media is most of it public domain. But you can see. It's hard to imagine today because I don't think we really grasp how big they are. I don't think that we really grasp. Now you can go to Santa Clara there and to the Ames Research Laboratory, and you can see that one of the hangars is still there, and just get an idea of how massive these were. So shoot, if I had a camera, I'd been filming the thing, and that's one of the reasons why they were filming so much when the Hindenburg was landing at Lakehurst. And so we do have a great record of these things, even though there weren't very many of them. The U.S. only ever operated a handful of these. It's kind of interesting because we were rolling up towards the Second World War. What if we had still had one operational at the war? Would they have been of any use? I honestly don't know.
It's hard to imagine. They certainly. There were reasons why we built them, and we certainly had ideas on how we would be able to use them in combat. But by the time, in wartime, but by the time we get to World War II, it's hard to imagine that they would have put up much of a fight against, say, a Zero or
no. But then the idea was that they would be kept out of sight and they would be operating, aircraft that would be used as scouting aircraft. Yeah. But at the time that we got, we started to get these scouting aircraft that had incredible ranges, like the PBYs and et cetera, and they really the whole purpose would have gone away. Yeah. I don't think there's any chance they could have been used in bombing in the Second World War. But what they were trying to do. With the Macon, that was the plan that was for them going forward, and the Macon was not that far off of when the war started.
No, we didn't even use them for that long. There was a fairly short period of when we were building these things, and it's all just in that interwar.
We didn't manage to hang on to them for very long.
Well, and the thing about it, you used the word impractical, and that probably explains the whole thing. But if you look at the technology that they used and where they moved forward, absolutely amazing. But if you put it all together and say this one and then this one and this one, basically when we end up doing the videos, why we show them and then we crash them and then we show them. And the other thing that is very we all have to be really aware of is most of it was weather. Most of it was the fact we didn't know what weather was going to do, and that affects everybody even today. It's one of those things that you have to be realistic about. Is you can control nature to a point, and then if you put something that big in the sky, then look what you end up with.
Well, and today it would probably be much safer because we'd have a much better idea where storm cells are.
That's true. We would be able to deal with that much better.
One of the ideas was Arctic research, and actually quite a lot of Arctic research was done with airships. And at the time, it was very risky to be trying to fly a plane up there. But an airship had the longevity to be able to do that. So, there was some really, there was some interest to the technology. They certainly did play a role in the Second World War, in the First World War, not the Second World War, in the First World War. And you can imagine at the time, they're very steampunky looking things.
Yeah.
You can imagine looking at those and thinking they're the future. And it's so funny to look at them now and see them as being, anachronisms.
Yeah. Well, and if you look at when they were launching and all the people standing down there watching, it had to have been a huge phenomena. and real encouragement to people to think that we had the ability to put something like that in the sky.
Yeah, to make something that big fly and operate it. Yeah, you know, a lot of the research from the NACA, the National Advisory Committee on Aviation, or on aeronautics, was done on the blimps and the Zeppelins, and we learned an awful lot about avionics from them. And now, as they look to use them, because there's some real uses for airships in things like weather research, they're digging up some of that old research that we learned from them. So there's still things that we picked up from them that's still being used today that might go to cutting edge technology today, because still, no matter what, everything else that we have that goes up requires that you have a ready fuel supply. And they can stay in the air for a very long time with much less fuel, and that's pretty exciting.
They also, if you watch, they started developing different types of cloth. They started putting things into cotton, and so if you think about that, there's a whole there again. You've got something that was developed for a need and a use that became something that's every day now.
That we used to, that was a big change from gold beater's cloth, was literally made out of cow intestines, and to being able to make rubberized cotton, which turned out to be what was the most successful.
It would have been an awful lot of intestine to get one of those things in the air.
I don't know how much gold beater cloth you get out of a particular cow.
How
many cows.
I guess if you're killing cows anyway to eat them, and at least
I don't think they were killing them for the intestines. I mean, I don't know if we use the intestines now. I don't know what do we do with the gold beater. What do we do with the gold beater cloth now? I don't have any idea if we're putting it to use.
But yeah, that's early in this episode, you talk about that, part of the reason why Zeppelins were such a big deal, which is when they did that bombing attack over London in World War I. And I think it was telling that, during the attack, those things were terrifying. They're just dark and up in the sky someplace dropping bombs. But then on their way back, I mean, what makes that attack fall apart is that is weather.
The wind blows, the wind blows in the wrong direction, and they get caught. So they were, and it's interesting that they were vulnerable to the anti-aircraft that was available on the front, but they didn't have that in London. I think we did another episode at one point about some ships with anti-aircraft guns trying to knock down.
Oh yeah.
And essentially Zeppelins were not accurate enough to hit a ship, and ships couldn't shoot high enough to hit a Zeppelin, and so they shoot at each other for hours on end. So it's interesting where those technologies are going at the time, and so that's that's an odd precursor to the Second World War, which is quite a bit different. But I mean, if you think about those, I mean, they're totally silent. You don't know they're there until the bombs are dropping. And it's not like they were used to the Blitz at that time. And look at the tragic story where it hits one house and kills 6 siblings that were, was it between 6 and 18? I guess the whole family.
They can't. They were not able to be all that precise in their targets. I mean, they were flying over the city and just
you can see the city below you,
chucking bombs out. But it was
but
it's
they
one
could
of those
carry much larger bombs than aircraft of the day, and so those bombs could be quite destructive.
And of course, the reason why London didn't have defenses the way that they did during World War II is that there was hardly any expectation that anything had that kind of range. And so once you got the Zeppelins, they had way greater range than any kind of plane that they had, which was only gonna be lucky if it could make it across the channel. that kind of thing.
You have to give props to those Germans too. That were, I mean, you were flying an explosive gas bag over the enemy.
That's the whole reason they captured the one is because the guys
they realize they're being shot at. It's going to blow up.
Which they were fully, and that was, it's interesting. I can't remember if you mentioned this, but part of the reason why the Hindenburg used hydrogen was because the U.S. was using helium.
The U.S. had much of the world's helium supply, and we for a very long time that went on even into the Cold War where we were embargoing all the helium because we had it.
So that they didn't really have a choice. They couldn't get the safer gas. Although as we see in this one, helium has its problems as well. One being that we never had enough.
Yeah, that we never had enough. I mean, there came a point where the helium reserve was so full that we started selling it off because we had more helium than we could deal with. So, but I mean, that's a whole other story too. We got, of course, a whole episode on helium and how we ended up with having large supplies of helium. So, I mean, those stories, they all tie together. It's very interesting. But it is interesting to have a weapon of war that was essentially so vulnerable that it is a balloon filled with explosive gas, and we still managed to use that. And so it's all just an interesting. These things were just fabulous. They're just fantastic, and I wish I could have seen one because I don't think that we can really grasp how amazing these things were. But they were, anything that big is going to be difficult to keep in the air, and that's what we found out.
My question to both of you is, if you'd have had a chance, would you have volunteered to go be on one?
Knowing what I know now, at the time, if it's like, hey, you want to get on the,
On a big balloon?
It is kind of funny. It seems strange today that they were operated by the Navy, not by the Army Air Corps.
Yeah. I was going to mention that, but one of the reasons I think that today, we've had an Air Force for so long, we think of them as separate groups, but at the time, the Navy had reasons why they would want stuff that could go into the air, and the Army had reasons. But it is interesting that that these were Navy blimps.
I think they sailed more like a ship, and the idea was that they're going to operate off of ships. But the original idea was that these would work as reconnaissance for the Navy. I don't think the U.S. ever thought about them as bombers. No. As the use that they had in the First World War. I think they always that idea, and of course, naval aviation came a long way much faster.
Yeah, and that's a good chunk of what happened is that this technology moved so quickly, but around them, because it certainly moved. I would think today that if we were going to build a war blimp, that we could make it probably sturdier and so that
we used war blimps in the Second World War.
We did actually,
and they were. They could stay in the air for a very long. They're much smaller than these, but they stay in the air for a lot longer. They were a lot more durable, and they were great for carrying depth charges. They were fantastic for submarine duty.
Yeah,
and that's why we used them.
Yeah, we used a lot of them. There's another episode that I've written that hasn't come out yet that we talk about some of the stuff that they did because they protected the West Coast out of Sunnyvale. There in San Francisco, and out of Moffett Field, and so we used them for coastal patrols and stuff all the time. It was really interesting because it's not where you tend to think of balloons in the Second World War. You think of that as a First World War thing, but they were still useful. It's just they were also way smaller for the most part. The blimps we were using in World War II, they weren't these
so
big
they made
ones.
them a lot less, much more agile and a lot less vulnerable to the weather. But we still had losses, and that's
true.
Another one of the episodes that we have on. We have quite a few episodes on blimps and dirigibles.
Actually, kind of surprising just how much balloons because we also have one Operation Outward, which is about these balloons that we tied metal cables to them to just knock stuff around essentially.
We also talked about one in the Civil War too.
Oh, that's right.
So there's a lot of good stories. They're amazing in a number of different ways. And of course, people still end up enjoy going up in hot air balloons. And it's not like it's gone away.
Well, and we just talked very seriously about a balloon that came over Alaska, part of Montana, and who knows how many more they talk about. And so balloons are not gone.
No. They apparently still have some military applications.
Whole other uses for them.
As far as we know, they do.
We talked about the way that these, the helium was so short. When we built the Los Angeles, we didn't even have enough helium to run both of them at the same time.
We took take the helium out of the Los Angeles to inflate the Shenandoah. Or was it the reverse?
I think the reverse. But either way, it's one of those interesting.
And that was the world's supply. Of helium.
Yeah. Crazy to think that these things were so big that they were using not just like an appreciable, but like a majority of the world's supply of helium.
Well, that whole story about helium is an interesting story too. That's another really good episode. We don't talk about it as much here because we talk about it in that other episode. Yeah. But that really, the disasters that came with 3 of the 4 American rigid airships largely had to do with modifications that we made because we didn't have enough helium. Yeah. And we couldn't afford to just vent, when we needed to. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's ultimately, they talk about that as being part of the reason why the Shenandoah went down, is it couldn't vent that air fast enough. And ultimately, these things were really impressive looking, but as Betty Jo said, they were very they were very at the whims of the weather, and when you get some wind hitting you or something like that, it's really easy to lose control of them, and that's what happened.
They were also all of the ones that we had were all experimental.
Yes,
and we learned a lot from them. Like we said, the NACA did a lot of research on them, and who's to say if that technology kept developing, what we might have come up with. You know, but the idea of like flying them cross country, and we did several times. We flew them
Yeah.
cross country successfully, but you just don't do that during, storm season.
Yeah.
And they were going to be used for Arctic research. They might have been fantastic for Arctic research. So it is, in a way, you can see, and Billy Mitchell made this argument, that it was somewhat tragic that the accidents that we had kept us from developing the technology into what it might have been. But on the other hand, of course, we also know now that everything that they did, we now do with aircraft.
Yeah.
And probably aircraft technologies at least turned out to be a lot more reliable. I mean, 3 out of 4 don't crash.
Or at least we get to see the Super Bowl in NASCAR.
That's true. Yeah, we are still
from a
using
different
blimps
view,
today.
and
Yeah,
so
yeah.
that's good too.
Yeah, there's only a handful of them. There's really only a handful of blimps in the world these days that are still functional.
Yeah, but I think we're actually building new and operating them with for weather research and stuff like that. I think they're very good for climate sort of research because they can stay aloft for such a long time.
And it's
So
a lot
they're coming
safer
back.
nowadays because we can tell you where the wind's going to be and whether you're going to hit. Because that's what almost all of the ones that went down hit some kind of storm.
Yeah.
You hit a storm cell and you're just.
Yeah, and now we know the weather much better. And we can avoid that much better. I know this will date me too, but I mean back in the day, when Johnny Carson would ever have something where the people in the audience would participate somehow, then they would give out stuff. And one of the things they regularly gave out were blimp rides, on the Goodyear blimp. Yeah. When I was a kid, I was like, that'd be awesome. I want to go to Carson so I can ride on a blimp.
Well, those ones don't fall down very often.
No, I don't think they actually ever lost one. So. Yeah.
Magellan TV is sponsoring this episode, and they sponsor all of our podcasts. And if you've listened to the podcast, you know that what we like to do is talk about what we've been watching on Magellan TV lately. And so what have you been watching on Magellan TV?
We had a great time. It's always, there's so much to watch on Magellan. And, there's a reason I love Magellan because there's just so many different things that you could go to. So we happened to go onto a nature documentary, and we watched a documentary called Ice Dogs. And it's about Greenland dogs, which are those. I think actually I saw something recently where they think that is actually the single oldest breed, but if not, they're among the oldest breeds of dogs in the world. And they, love to run in the snow. And it was really the story of two sets of dogs. One was they were Inuit or natives live in Greenland. I don't know, 500 miles north of the Arctic Circle. They got a village there, and most of the time the dogs protect the village from the polar bears. And then in summer they strap them up to the sleds and they go out and they get enough food to make it through.
They kill muskox and they kill seals.
So you got 18 days of summer, and in that time you got to hunt enough food to hunker down the rest of the year so that the dogs can protect you from the polar
Off
bears.
they go, and then thank heaven they come back and bring food for and they don't need freezers.
Yeah,
it's really
that's
nice
true.
because it was 32 below Celsius. What was it?
Yeah, so but you always share with you kill a muskox, you give some to the dogs, or you always kill an extra seal and you feed that to the dogs, and it's very interesting how they live up there, and the dogs are very started off with one of them there it got too cold and the puppies died. That's what we got. It's the first thing that we got to watch, and so they're crying, but and the other one was an explorer who was going up to way up. What is that called? It's not
The
Franz Josef Land.
island
It's,
that's right outside.
Svalbard, Svalbard, whatever. It's like it's the northernmost of the cantons of Norway, and it's halfway between Norway and the North Pole. And he just goes. What they were doing is they were taking the dogs up there to test the most efficient way to travel with the dogs and the sleds. So theirs was an experiment.
And it was really interesting because they took the dogs and they'd have either 3 or 5 or however many. They'd attach them to the sled, but the men would ski.
Yeah, the men were on
So
skis,
they
but
would-
they were still attached being pulled by the dogs. So they're trying to figure out when you got the dog, the guy on the skis,
got
and the
the
sled, what's
the-
the most efficient way to hitch them up? So.
Oh, well, and the easiest way, that way you're using the energy of the person and the energy of the dogs, and you can take that much more with you. And I don't understand why we need to know this, but it was really interesting that they decided to show it to us.
So that's why you can go to Magellan at any given time and you can watch. You can watch history or true crime, or this is kind of a combination of history and nature. And there's just always so much to watch on Magellan. What have you been watching lately on Magellan TV?
So, speaking of the wide range of things that you can watch, I was watching an archaeology documentary. I love archaeology. I feel like in a different life, I might have been an archaeologist. It's called Mystery of the Roman Skulls. And what it's about is that they've been finding these skulls without the rest of the bones in London for decades, apparently. But especially they were building some some infrastructure, and they started just pulling up just like clusters of these things. And so they're just skulls. They have no other bones, and they're in weird groups. And so it's a mystery. And so it's about that mystery. I have to say, I don't know that you'll have to kind of watch it yourself and try to decide if you think that any one of the particular possibilities they suggest is what you think it is. Because the truth is, we just don't know. They talk about one of the possibilities is they're like, oh, well, it could have been Boudica's revolt. We did an episode about Boudica, and she comes through and burns London to the ground, Londinium at the time. And so they were like thinking that these were maybe all decapitated heads of the victims of Boudica for the folks who had stayed behind. But there's some reasons why maybe that's unlikely. And then there are all these other questions about, because in the Roman period, London was pretty peaceful. And so they're trying to understand, why are there all these skulls? If it was a peaceful in that period. And they really come up with some interesting ideas on how maybe these skulls got there. But there's always, it seems like every time they have, this theory, they, at the end of it, they are like, but this, this seems to say that maybe it's not that. And so it's really a mystery. And I think it's really cool, it really connects history and archaeology. It's really, really interesting. And just like you said, there is always something interesting to watch on Magellan TV. And you honestly never know what it's going to be. I looked through and I was looking through all kinds of stuff. And then that was one of the ones that I had stopped on, and it was really, really worth the watch.
And of course, if you are a listener or watcher of The History Guy, you can always go to try.magellantv.com/historyguy, where we will always have a deal for you. Sometimes a free month, or a deal on an annual membership, or even a documentary that you can watch for free. Again, that's try.magellantv.com/historyguy.
Next up, the History Guy tells the story of the Macon.
The age of rigid airships, like the famous Hindenburg, was a brief but exciting time when the impressive vessels were seen to be at the forefront of a technological revolution. They played an important part in the First World War, especially as used by Germany, and after the war they were the subject of much research and production by nations all around the world because they were still thought to be important military assets. In the 1920s, the United States began testing the idea of using rigid airships as aircraft carriers, able to launch and recover aircraft, which led to the construction of two extraordinary airships, USS Akron and USS Macon, among the largest airships ever built. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The United States had first entered the dirigible game with the construction of the USS Shenandoah, constructed between 1922 and 1923, the first of 4 rigid airships built by the U.S. Navy. Instead of using the abundant but highly flammable hydrogen for lift, the U.S. instead chose helium, much more rare but also considerably safer. The U.S. also for decades controlled the only known helium reserves in the world. The second ship commissioned by the Navy was USS Los Angeles, which was commissioned on November 25, 1924. The Los Angeles was actually built by the German Zeppelin Company in Germany as part of reparations promised at the end of World War I. The Navy made some adjustments once the Los Angeles reached the United States, including changing its lifting gas from hydrogen to helium. On July 3, 1929, the Los Angeles was in the air, cruising at a speed of 48 knots near the airships based at Lakehurst, New Jersey, when a U-01 plane, piloted by Lieutenant A.W. Gorton, successfully hooked on to a dangling trapeze and was then released. Testing of the trapeze was meant to investigate if using the airships to carry planes was even feasible. The trapeze included a U-shaped yoke, while the plane had been fitted with a hook. The pilot carefully flew his plane beneath the dirigible, lined up the hook, and connected the plane to the underside of the Los Angeles. The pilot could then disconnect the hook using a cord in the cabin and return to flight. Several other tests followed, and the concept was judged feasible, but there were numerous technological and engineering issues to iron out. The trapeze system was later designed to be retractable, so planes could be loaded in the airship's hangars before being lowered into launching position. Of course, the primary question involved was what kind of planes could be used on board the airships, as not just any plane would do. Into this void came the Curtiss F-9C Sparrowhawk. The planes had originally been designed for use aboard naval carriers, and as a prototype, the XF-9C-1 was delivered to the Navy in March of 1931. The 20-foot planes were armed with 2 30-inch Browning machine guns, and in their initial carrier tests tested well. However, they proved to be unsuitable for use on carriers. Already the Navy was working on their new airships, the ZRS-4 and the ZRS-5. Shortly after the successful testing of plane recapture aboard the Los Angeles, the Navy commissioned construction of the USS Akron and her sister ship, Macon, at the end of October 1929. The construction was done by the Goodyear Zeppelin Corporation, part of a joint project between Goodyear and the German Luftschiffbau, meaning airship construction, Zeppelin Company. The airships were designed to be huge, to provide space for what would be 4 hangars. While the Hindenburg and the Graf Zeppelin were slightly longer, about 20 feet, and slightly more voluminous, neither of the German airships would have been using lifting helium, making the Akron and Macon the largest helium-lifted, rigid airships ever built. They were among the largest flying objects in the world at the time. Though construction began at the same time, the Macon differed from her sister in several significant ways. Perhaps most importantly, the Akron was only able to ever carry 3 planes, thanks to several structural girders that obstructed the aftmost hangars. The Akron could carry 2 planes in its hangars, plus 1 aboard the trapeze. While the Akron's bays were never fixed, the Macon was able to carry all 5 planes, 4 in the hangars and 1 aboard the trapeze. Another difference lay in the material used for the inflatable gas bags. France, Germany, and Britain primarily used gold beater skin, which is made of animal intestine. Its name comes from its traditional use in gold beating, a process of creating gold leaf. Half of the Akron's gas bags were made of Goodyear rubberized cotton, while the other half used an experimental cotton-based fabric suffused with a gelatin latex compound, which proved to be so successful that all of the Macon's gas bags were made of it. The Macon also received more advanced propellers. The Sparrowhawk had been chosen because it was relatively small, about 20 feet long with a 25-foot wingspan, although it had a number of significant drawbacks as well. It was heavy, as it had originally been designed to withstand aircraft carrier landings, and it had relatively poor range and handling, and had poor downward visibility from the cockpit. As the planes were largely envisioned as a means to broaden the airship's use as reconnaissance tools, the Sparrowhawk was imperfect. A lighter, faster plane would have been ideal, however none existed that could fit within the ship's hangars. This kind of fighter, meant to be air-launched from a larger aircraft or mothership, is called a parasite fighter. In addition to their use aboard rigid airships, during the 20th century various countries would experiment with heavy bombers that would carry parasite fighters for their own protection, though they were never widely used. In addition to the Sparrowhawks, the Macon was also capable of carrying 2 specially built 2-seater Fleet Model 1s for training, and 2 2-seat Waco UBF XJW-1 biplanes were also built with skyhooks for use aboard the Macon. Ultimately, only a handful of planes were ever built for the ships. At least 7 Sparrowhawks, of which only 1 survives, and can be seen today at the National Air and Space Museum's Udvar Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia, and 6 of the Special Fleet Model 1s, in addition to a prototype. One difficulty of engineering stood above the rest during the construction of the sister ships. During the design stage, the fins were altered, as the Graf Zeppelin had nearly snagged her fin on power lines during takeoff from a field in California earlier that year. American officers had witnessed that near accident and sought to find a better system. The change, which included moving the control car, would allow direct observation of the fins, although the fins had to be moved and attached to an intermediate ring instead of a main ring. The Akron's maiden flight took place in September of 1931. The Macon didn't fly for another 20 months when it flew over northern Ohio for almost 13 hours on April 21st, 1933. Unfortunately, the Macon never flew with her sister ship. The Akron was lost just weeks before, on April 4th, 1933, with a loss of 73 of her 76 crew. One of the surviving crew was Executive Officer Lieutenant Commander Herbert Wiley, who took command of the Macon in 1934. By then, the Macon was the only rigid airship in naval service. The Shenandoah was lost in 1925, and Los Angeles was decommissioned in 1932. The Macon served an important role, developing strategies and doctrine for using the airship for reconnaissance, especially in keeping the airship out of sight, while the Sparrowhawks performed reconnaissance missions. The Macon's crew began removing the Sparrowhawk's landing gear and replacing it with a fuel tank, which gave the little plane 30% more range. On October 12, 1933, the Macon flew from the East Coast across the country to her permanent home base at Naval Air Station Sunnyvale, now Moffett Federal Airfield, near San Francisco. In April of 1934, the Macon flew cross-country to Opelika, Florida. Flying over mountains on the route would require the ship to reach or exceed its pressure height, that is, the height at which internal pressure of the gas bags is equivalent to external atmospheric pressure. At that height, the bags automatically vent air from the bags to prevent them from rupturing. For a time over Texas, heat from the sun caused helium to warm enough to force the ship to reach pressure height unintentionally. This forced the Macon to dump 9,000 pounds of ballast and 7,000 pounds of fuel and run its engines at full power to maintain lift and control in a gust storm near Van Horn, Texas, which caused 2 girders to fail. The crew was able to do emergency repairs, and the Macon arrived in Florida safely. The ship was grounded for more permanent repairs, but the full repairs were not completed. Most importantly, it was decided that strengthening the girders near the top talon could wait until the next scheduled overhaul, when the gas bags could be deflated. In July of 1934, with Herbert Wiley in command, the ship tracked the USS Houston, a cruiser then carrying President Franklin Delano Roosevelt back to California from Hawaii. The meeting was a complete surprise for the President and the Navy. Macon delivered newspapers to the President, and the Houston sent the following message. The President compliments you and your planes on your fine performance and excellent navigation. Well done, and thank you for the papers. The President. The following year, on February 12, 1935, repairs from the earlier damage were still not complete. The ship was returning to Sunnyvale after maneuvers, having participated in a fleet exercise off the Santa Barbara Islands when it was caught in a storm near Point Sur. The storm caused structural damage to a reen which held the upper tail fin, which failed completely. The fin broke away. Debris punctured several gas bags, and the crew immediately dumped all the ballast in an attempt to raise the tail and keep the ship in the air. The ship had lost around 20% of its lift, but the loss of an enormous amount of ballast forced the ship up rapidly, to an altitude of almost 5,000 feet, above pressure height, and the gas bags vented more helium. Historian Richard Smith suggests that the loss of the fin was not catastrophic, but that the failure of the Macon was due to the rapid abandonment of ballast in the first few minutes after the tail fin detached. He contends that it wasn't until the ship began venting more precious helium above its pressure height that the ship became doomed. The ship's engines also continued to run, which may have contributed to the ship's rapid climb as well. One witness described it. She plunged downward and then suddenly rose and disappeared into the storm clouds. The crew fought to regain control of the ship, which sunk relatively slowly over the course of almost 30 minutes following the initial accident. Wiley's first report was that the ship had a casualty in stern. He later radioed that we'll abandon ship as soon as we land on the water somewhere 20 miles off Point Sur, probably 10 miles at sea. Many witnesses and newspapers reported rumors of an explosion. However, the damage to the airship was solely caused by the storm. After the ship had hit the water, it began to sink rapidly, within 20 minutes, while the crew fired off a rocket to announce their position. Already ships from the fleet that the Macon had been on maneuvers with were racing towards it. The USS Pennsylvania reported that Macon survivors located, assistance no longer needed. 81 of the 83 crew members were rescued, thanks to the fact that after the loss of the Akron, the ship had been supplied with life preservers. Commander Wiley was the only man to survive the crash of both ships. 2 men died. Radioman First Class Ernest Edwin Daly jumped ship too early, and Mess Attendant First Class Florentino Edquiba drowned attempting to recover personal belongings from the sinking ship. The crash marked the end of the Navy's use of rigid airships. Representative Carl Vinson held back a bill to build 2 more airships, saying that the loss of the Akron and Macon increases doubt of the practicability of airships. Others attempted to defend airships. Famous pilot and Indy 500 driver Eddie Rickenbacker said the crash should not discourage further development of dirigibles, but should lead to more intense research to perfect construction. Hugo Echner, commander of the Graf Zeppelin, also declared that the loss doesn't prove the Zeppelin impracticable. The U.S. would not build any more airships, however, and technological improvements of planes would soon make them obsolete. Though lost only a short distance from shore, the wreckage was only relocated in February of 1991 by the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. The ship had sunk 1,476 feet, too deep for most kinds of diving. In 2006, along with Stanford University and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a number of remote vehicles took over 10,000 images and high-definition video of the wreck. The actual location remains a secret, but is within the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, established in 1992 and administered by NOAA. The Macon represented a unique time in aeronautics history when the dirigibles outpaced the fleet ships and served an important reconnaissance role. In the age of the graceful airships, despite all the disasters, certainly, captured the imagination. And the use of dirigibles as an aircraft carrier lives on in fiction. Heck, in 1938, Indiana Jones and his dad escaped a dirigible in an airplane. The wreck of the Macon includes 4 Sparrowhawks, and only one other survives. It is in the collection of the Smithsonian Institution.
So, the Macon is a later airship, and in some ways, it's very, very similar to the Shenandoah because it's not that much later. But in other ways, it was very different from the Shenandoah.
Yeah, and we've learned quite a bit in between the two,
Yep.
and then we're putting that to use. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting because they were in the development process.
Yeah.
And, I mean, did we just not develop enough? Or, I mean, did we just find out that really they can't? I mean, given that we lost both Akron and Macon, it's kind of hard to say. Maybe we should have kept doing more. That's kind of a tough sell, yeah.
Well, and they were planning on doing more. Even up to the loss of the Macon, they had plans for at least 2 more that were ordered.
I understand why they decided that, moving on with that line of technology was perhaps not worth it anymore.
You've got these two technologies that we saw as competing technologies, and they're coming together. And that's really fascinating. Catching the airplane on the trapeze, taking it into the hangar. What a fantastic idea! It'd be great for a movie. It'd be great for a book.
Yeah.
Turned out to be, kind of, only so successful in reality. And even if we talked about, even if we carried that into the war. I mean, certainly, those planes weren't going to be effective as scouting planes anymore. I mean, it was difficult to produce an aircraft for it. But we were trying that same idea. I mean, years later, we're trying to figure out an idea of a trapeze fighter so that you could carry an airborne mothership that could carry.
Yeah.
Honestly, the Zeppelin is a better idea for that than a bomber because they'd have so much more space and hangar space and et cetera. But I mean, we ended up, it turns out that aircraft carriers kind of became the future of naval combat, and so it was an interesting idea. So you find very little, sort of historical footage that is more interesting than them catching those planes on those trapeze, pulling them up inside the aircraft and inside the Zeppelin and working on them, the dirigible. I mean, it's amazing to see. Amazing that we did that. You don't even believe that we did that. And now those, you can go with an ROV and see those under the ocean. That's interesting too.
Yeah, that's, they were pretty interesting planes. Ultimately, the only reason that the Sparrowhawk was used at all, because it didn't end up working for, what they wanted it to do when it was on the carriers.
It didn't have a strong enough airframe for the carrier landings. Yeah. And
so it was just the Zeppelins essentially saved, that design. But I wonder if we had, if we'd been able to put R&D essentially specifically to a plane that would have been designed, specifically to work on, because they weren't perfect. They were too heavy because they were supposed to land on carriers and stuff. If we could have come up with a better plane, that would have been more useful specifically to that role. But it really is incredible that they could carry these things in that they had hangars inside the blimp.
Yeah.
That's not just one big balloon. They've got lots of space in there.
Maybe we'll do that now. We'll build one. We'll tether it. We'll put fighters in there, and they'll shoot down Chinese balloons.
We might need it.
I'm amazed too that they had the communication skills to do what they were doing then too, to get to send it off and have it come back, and it was developed sooner than I had thought about when I was watching that. But what a crazy looking thing with those planes hanging down.
But eventually they just took the wheels off the planes. They were never going to land, right?
They didn't need the wheels on them. Yeah, they're just reducing the weight so that they could add more fuel and stuff to them.
Does that make you nervous if you're flying around with an airplane that doesn't have any wheels?
You better hope the Zeppelin's back. That gives you even better reason for you to guard your dirigible, because your airship is the only place you can land.
No, I don't like that wheelless deal.
That's trouble for the pilots. Yeah, they're not going to be anywhere else you're going to land those things. And this is a good way for us to talk about how you had mentioned in the, when we were talking earlier, we never really moved past the experimental stage on these Zeppelins, these rigid airships. They were all very interesting, but we were trying out all kinds of things and learning lots of new things. But we had never really figured out, that where we were going to, what exactly their role would have been. We were still figuring that out, when we built the Macon and the Akron, is that this was a way that they could work. And they did actually all right. And, when we did war games and stuff like that, they performed decently. And it's cool that they were able to catch those planes with fair accuracy. Because it was years and years later, when we were doing mid-air fueling and stuff like that. And this was similar in that you had to get two things that were flying to match up at the same time. It's crazy. It's a really, truly crazy
they
concept.
got that little trapeze. It was just hard to imagine. But on the other hand, with those biplanes, they did all, the Barnstormers did all sorts of crazy stuff. They played tennis on top of the things. So, but I mean, that would have to take a crazy skilled pilot. But I mean, crazy. Like, we had the X-1 tail sitter. We had an airplane that was supposed to land like a helicopter and pitch and ships and stuff like that. We tried all sorts of crazy stuff.
Yeah.
Because the idea that you could have a mothership and then launch an airplane, because airplanes had relatively limited range, was really fascinating. So it's really, it's just, I don't think that most people, we talk about forgotten history on the History Guy. I don't think that most people realized that we had airships, even more or less, that we had airships that were built to carry airplanes, and that we had that vision. And it's just a really interesting part of history. And it's it's really fun to look at those and say, wow, that's a if anything else, you can see why if you were a little kid, you would love to have gotten
Yeah.
the toy Zeppelin and get Christmas like they had.
Yeah.
There's a toy Zeppelin in Christmas Story.
Yeah.
You're like, yeah, I don't play with that thing. So I mean, it's a fascinating piece of history. It's a fascinating piece of aviation history. It's a fascinating piece of military aviation history. It's a fascinating piece of American history. And in the end, too, it's a tragedy because so many lives are lost. These are people who put their entire lives at risk. And one commander that survived both the Akron and the Macon.
That's quite a story. He's the one guy who was on the Akron. Can you imagine getting onto the Akron because when the Akron went down, almost everybody on board died. Just a handful of people
Only
survived.
3 of them left.
Yeah, what they really learned from the Akron is that they had no plan for if you went into the water. They didn't have rafts, they didn't have life vests, anything, and so most of them just sunk with the wreckage. And that's one of the parts of the story is to say that difference from the Akron where only like 3 survived, and the Macon where only 2 died, and both of them by making mistakes. I mean, they really should have been
What do
able
you
to survive.
suppose he said though when they said, "Hey, do you want to run this other one?"
Yeah, can you imagine being like, I'll go get on the
We're
the
back into
sister.
that.
You're
back on
the
volunteer
single
deal.
officer who survived. You want to go do it again?
I mean, fortunately, when the Macon went down, they were in a lot of ways in a better position. It was relatively calm compared to when the Akron went down.
Yes.
And close to shore, and there were boats that were able to get there
quickly. And it took
quickly.
a long time to go down. They had plenty of time to plan for the. I mean, they knew they were going down. So, I mean, but still, and that's when you think about it too, because we talk about how big they are, and etc. When you put that much resource into one ship, it's like losing an aircraft carrier.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that is a massive, massive loss that is very, very difficult to replace. But that piece of history is preserved as a shipwreck now.
Yeah.
And if everybody doesn't know, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is the agency that manages shipwrecks in United States waters. So they're the agency in charge of monitoring the Titanic, the agency that's in charge of monitoring the Macon. And so it was also an interesting story that they discovered the Macon, that they know where it is, that we were able to use ROVs to record that where that is, and that's all history too. I mean, that underwater archaeology is very fascinating in its own way. So there's a lot of amazing stories around. I mean, you would say maybe that the Macon was just a failed experiment, never did anything in combat, didn't actually last very long before it crashed, and they ended up being just kind of a novelty item that we didn't pursue. But you could also say that this was an important part of history and the development of aeronautics and the development of tactics and planning for military aviation, and also just a great model of what we could do. I mean, it's hard to imagine. Today it's hard even to imagine that we could build a flying machine that's as big as the Empire State Building. And that would land. That could go to the Empire. The Empire State Building was built to catch one, and you would walk off the end and go down to the Empire State Building. So I mean,
really cool.
I mean, they're just fascinating. Yeah.
They were really amazing.
Well, I've been on a hot air balloon, so I guess
It's so not at least the hot air balloons. They don't usually go. We're usually smart enough not to put those up in a storm, right? That's
weather again.
Some losses there too.
When the Macon crashed, they describe it, and I think of how crazy it must have been to have witnessed it, where you see this, I mean, huge thing, that they talk about it, falling down and then just shooting up, just flying up into the clouds. And I'm like, that must have been an incredible, just an incredible thing to witness. And of course, now as with any accident, they start talking about, whose fault it was or what went wrong. And we talked in the episode about how the guy had said it was probably okay until they released too much ballast in the instance after it was damaged, and then that's probably what doomed it.
Happens on ships too. I mean, you make a reaction, and if physics is involved, and if you make the wrong reaction. So it's true. I mean, there were all 3 of those accidents. There were various things that happened that you can rethink later, and but we also, cars crash and airplanes crash, and all the things that we have today still crash. The space shuttles do. So it's we find out this week, submarines, submersibles. I mean, they all had their level of risk, and what we found out, the age of airships wasn't very long, partly because other technologies simply surpassed them, and partly because there's real limitations to trying to operate a vehicle that is the size of a skyscraper.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten History, and if you did, you can find more on our website, thehistoryguy.com.
We release podcasts every 2 weeks, so stick around if you want to hear more podcasts of Forgotten History. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. You can even get a personalized message from the History Guy himself on Cameo.